بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Welcome once again to another special edition of SCDawah Live, and today we have some special guests. Most of you are familiar with them. Muhammad Hijab, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and Brother Hamza Zosis, Assalamu alaikum to both of you. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, everything is well. How are you, bro?
MashaAllah, Alhamdulillah, bi khair. It's rainy sitting outside. I've been cycling, almost drenched. But there you go, that's how life is. But Alhamdulillah, it's a beautiful day, even in rain. Yeah, I mean, people don't appreciate how even the rain can be a sign of the proof of the Creator. So today's topic is actually quite relevant. We are going to discuss about the leap of faith. What do we mean by that? This is something that we will discuss. Our panel members, Hijab and Hamza, will discuss this, because people don't realize that actually even in atheism, there are lots and lots of leaps of faith. In fact, every kind of belief system, whether it's a belief without God or belief in God, there are leaps of faith, as you will see. But what we want to focus on today specifically is the idea of whether the belief in atheism is rational or not. And on the same token, we want to talk about, is Islam rational or not as a belief system? Because Islam, why Islam and atheism, and why not Islam and Buddhism, or why not atheism and Sikhism? There's a reason for it. Because atheism seems to be a major ideological movement that we see now taking place within our youth and within our educated communities. And Islam seems to be the only other rational alternative, even the atheist community would admit. Because if there is a creator, that creator has to be one and only. Has to be one and only absolute creator. And that picture or the concept is only provided by, in its purity, Islam and Islam only. Right? So today we are going to really scrutinize this belief system of atheism. And of course, we would like our guests who are going to join with us, and you're welcome to join, and the address to join will be shown very shortly, to criticize and to really argue the case whether Islam or atheism, which one makes the rational sense. Because we don't want to really focus on our leap of faith belief. You can believe in a spaghetti monster as your God, but is that rational? That's the question. So when we talk about Islam as a belief concept, as an ideological belief concept, is this rational, or in fact, is this the only rational standpoint? This is what we're going to, inshallah, focus and explore and unpack. So without further ado, let's hear some background information about this topic, because I think it's important. I'm sure our panel members will agree. We need to define our terms. What do we mean by rationality? What do we mean by even reason? What do we mean by some concepts which make sense to us? So intellect, reason, rationality. What do we even mean by faith? Where does faith come in? Is it a blind belief, or is there evidence based and so on? So let's start with Brother Hamza, if you don't mind, Brother Muhammad Hijab. Tafaddal, go ahead.
Oh, there's so much there. Oh my God, you put me on the spot. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so generally speaking, when we speak about rationality, we really thinking about the use of our cognitive faculties, that we use them in a sound way. So when it comes to, for example, our reasoning, that our logical reasoning is sound, that there are valid logical connections between the various beliefs and statements and presuppositions that we assert and affirm. Also, when we have a particular belief or we make a statement, we try and ensure that that statement is rational. Now, when we use the word rational in that context, we say it has some kind of justification. For example, when I say I have a phone in my hand, now that presupposition, that assertion, that statement can be justified because I say, look, it's over here. It's phone in my hand, right? So from that perspective, this is what we mean by rationality, that things make sense, that the logical flow of our arguments are valid and they're sound. Valid meaning that they have valid logical connections between the conclusion and the premises, even when we make an inference, that it's a valid inference. And each of the premises or statements or assertions that we make, they have some form of what you would call a justification. So some kind of evidence for it. Now, the word evidence is quite big. You could refer to empirical evidence, you could refer to other types of evidence, but the point is, this is generally speaking what we mean by rationality. And obviously, from an academic philosophical perspective, there's so much more to unpack, but I think that's a good start.
Jazak Allah Khair. I just want to say assalamu alaikum to Brother Imran. Welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, delighted to be here, mashallah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Dr. Imran Bhai, Habibi.
No, how are you, brother? You well, mashallah?
May Allah bless you.
I mean, likewise, inshallah, may Allah reward you all for all your efforts, inshallah.
Ameen.
I was just introducing the subject today. So it's a topic on the leap of faith, Islam or atheism, which is rational. So Brother Hamza just explained the foundational concepts. What do we actually mean by reason or rationality when we say, like, intellectually grasp something and comprehend something? What does it entail? Does it entail a leap of faith, or there's some kind of reason and evidence behind it? And of course, the evidence part, we're going to leave it for later. So I'm going to just now turn to Brother Muhammad Hijab to just briefly introduce this subject a bit more. I mean, why in the world today? I mean, you don't have to answer my question straight away, but you can, bring your own understanding here. Why in the world today that we see a trend in people becoming an atheist or choosing this ideology for atheism?
All right, so I'll start with the first point about, and just to reiterate some of the concepts that was also mentioned.
Yeah.
So usually, and if you look at dictionary definitions, it's pretty clear that rationality is that which pertains to reason or logic. That's usually that's a standard dictionary definition of what the word rationality is, right? And reason is that which requires justification or explanation. That's once again across the board the dictionary definitions of these two terms. So why it's important to ask the question, is atheism rational, is because actually the burden of proof is upon the one who is making the claim. So if someone is saying that atheism is rational, in the English language, what that means to me, okay, is that it has a justification and explanation. So if someone believes that atheism is rational, they're effectively saying atheism as a belief or lack of belief, or whatever it may be, it's justified, and it has explanatory or refutational power. So what we're saying is that actually that kind of claim cannot be made about atheism, because atheism doesn't have explanatory or refutational power, because it doesn't have any power at all. Because what can atheism do? I mean, atheism is just telling you what the lack of belief someone has. That's basically what atheism is doing. So the lack of belief in certain thing, which is in this case a deity or deities or theism or whatever it may be. And this kind of postulation is lacking. It's lacking in every single way. So in what way can such postulation have refutational power in and of itself, or explanational power? So I think from those angles, you can't really claim as an atheist that atheism is rational. On the second point on why is atheism spreading out, I actually wrote a small booklet recently. It's on the Sapiens website. It's you can download it for free, actually. It's sapiensinstitute.org, and then go to the book section, go down, and the scientific deception of the new atheist movement. Because I was watching a clipping of or a video clip, or an interview actually, of Richard Dawkins having a conversation with one of the Sun reporters. And at one point, the Sun reporter asked him, "Do you think you're winning?" Like, obviously he's made it a stated objective to try and demolish religion, Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins replied, "Yes, we are winning," and so on and so forth. So I decided in my my work to actually look at what impact is new atheism in particular having. And what the conclusion is, long story short, but the conclusion is new atheism is not really that prominent in the West. New atheism is different to agnosticism. What's prominent is irreligiosity and agnosticism. That is what most people are. If you ask the average person in the streets of London or the streets of Birmingham what their religious beliefs are, they might say they're lacking in religious belief. But if you ask them about God in particular, they'll give you different kinds of answers. And that's even if we're talking about London cosmopolitan areas in the UK or the US, because Pew has very similar findings. So what we know from the findings, the data that we have, is that approximately 5.5%, according to Linda Woodhead, who's seen as writing, some of the most, academically rigorous papers on this. 5.5% approximately in 2018 of the British population are atheists in a strident way, in the same way as Richard Dawkins would be, which is exactly the same number, according to the census that we have, or the latest data from the British attitude surveys of Muslims in this country. So just put this in perspective. The amount of atheists there are in that strident sense, the Richard Dawkins sense, in the UK is roughly the same as the amount of Muslims that there are. And so really the threat, if you like, isn't as big as we think it is. It's more of a threat of agnosticism. It's people leaving religion and then not knowing the answer. The second thing is Pew Research, and most of its findings have found the same thing relates to American public. And I think the most rigorous and most cross-sectional survey that was done in Pew on the American dynamic, approximately 90% of people believed in a higher power. 90%. That's a large number of people. 90% is the vast majority. Having said this, once again, I like to differentiate here between atheism, agnosticism, religiosity, and these things. I don't think atheism is having the effect maybe we think it's having on the public. I think agnosticism is, and people are just leaving religion. And why are people leaving religion? That's I would say a social movement that was started from the 60s. Most of the sociologists that I've consulted with in my work, and once again, you can check the book or the booklet. It's a small booklet. You can read it in probably a day or something like this. You can check this out. Most of it is to do with political liberalism or this philosophy, because it became somewhat of a replacement for morality. And when basically, to put it this way, when British parents were raising their children, they weren't telling them, you have to be a Christian, you have to do the sacraments and do the liturgy and go to church on a Sunday. You were saying you can do whatever you want. And that message was trickled down, okay, from the 60s to the 70s, and you can believe in whatever you want. And they were not certain in what they were trying to espouse to them. So because of this, from the 60s onwards, this liberal attitude effectively replaced the Christian ethic. Effectively replaced it. Not in all parts of obviously the Western world, but in a large part of the demographic. So liberalism has effectively been the cause, in my opinion. Obviously, we don't want to be reductionist, but one of the main causes, and this is actually something that Linda Wood says herself, of the liberalization of society has caused this agnosticism or this irreligiosity. So in theory, and that's why we, in Sapiens Institute and in other institutes, we find it very important to expose political liberalism for what it is, because if that seeps into the Muslim community, okay, the same kind of trends can happen. All right, people can become irreligious. So the real threat, that if you want to call it the head of the snake, if you want to put it in this, vivid analogous term, is really political liberalism. That is the head of the snake. The head of the snake is not atheism per se. It's actually liberalism, because liberalism is a new ethic which people have now, which because of they will question their religion, and it's actually a replacement for them to their religion, just like was in the case of Christianity. People don't become atheists because of atheistic arguments. People become atheists because they become liberalized, for the most part. That's usually what happens. Or they become agnostic because of that. That's what we've seen, really. It's not because there's some powerful atheistic counter-argument to the God arguments that we have. That's not what we're seeing. And so therefore, Richard Dawkins' postulation that they're winning is a fumbling, is weak and feeble, really. So that's what I think. I think we have to differentiate between atheism and agnosticism, irreligiosity, illiberalism, and all those things, and we need to have really good compartments there, know what's what.
Jazak Allah Khair for this brilliant explanation. I think root of all of this, if you were to understand the root cause of things, I mean, you can actually pinpoint few things as you highlighted. So liberalization of taking personal opinions and wishes and dictates to guide you and make your life the way you want to live, your own desires. So if this is the drive, and of course religion or a belief in a creator or a deity is going to restrict that freedom from you. And liberal ideas is where you want to get away from this restriction from religion or religious boundaries, and you want to follow your own desires. So ultimately, it does seems to come to a point where it's actually your own self, on ego. So you're going along with your ego and its desires, because you know in religion, whether it's any religion, organized or disorganized or unorganized, whatever it might be, there are restrictions to your freedom and to your liberty, and that's why you choose this path. So atheism is not actually because of all these arguments and scientific advancements of science and technology and what have you. Because of this, people become like, there is no God because there is no evidence for it, or there's no evidence against it. Is actually rooted to what Brother Muhammad Hijab is highlighting. So excellent point made, and we want to get some of our atheist friends who will join us to see if you can challenge that idea and critique that idea and see. I want to now before I go to our other guests who have joined, we will come to you shortly, but I want to go to Brother Dr. Imran. What do you think Islam, of course, as I said, as an introduction, you can bring your whatever you want to say in this particular topic, but if you can also add to this point, why do we see Islam rational? Why do we consider even Islam to be a rational belief system? Because people generally think a belief is irrational. It's something where you suppress your intellect, something where you suppress reason, you just believe blindly in this blind faith. So when it comes to Islam, why is it that we see totally differently? We see actually Islam is reasonable, Islam is rational. In fact, that is the only choice one can make. Go ahead. Any other thoughts as well, if you have? You need to unmute yourself. You're still muted, Doctor.
Jazak Allah Khair. So, much of the brothers have made excellent points, and I totally agree with Brother Hijab's and Muhammad Hijab's analysis. But what we tend to find is that we're dealing with one end of the spectrum. We're dealing with people who have already gone through some sort of effect on their maybe their ideas or even their iman, and we're trying to counter that at one end of the spectrum, which is usually we're dealing with adults who have at some stage of their life had some sort of interaction with people who have questioned their faith, and they because of a lack of a grounding in their faith from a basic level, they're then having these doubts and they're having these discussions, and which is where a lot of the dawah is aimed at. Now, anecdotally, very interestingly, actually, I have children, obviously, and I have a daughter who was actually she's just gone into secondary school, literally a month into secondary school, mashallah. May Allah protect all of the children of the world and keep them in faith and make them the corners of our eyes, inshallah. And she had been set some homework. So, as a parent does, I was having a look to see what this homework was, and there was a question on religion. So the first few questions that were there were very straightforward, comparing different world religions. And then the last question was actually, let me just find it, because I had to take a picture of it because we ended up discussing this for a few hours. The last question that was given, I'll read it to you. This is almost an essay question for an 11-year-old who's just come out of primary school. This is a statement: God does not exist. Do you agree with this statement? Why might some people disagree with you? What evidence do you have to support your points? Now, for me to see that question, I was taken aback. I honestly was taken aback. I didn't really mind the question itself, but I thought maybe the age group and the person, in terms of their world experience and even understanding basics of many sort of fundamental things that you need in our life to understand the world and everything around us, were probably not there to be able to answer this. So I found myself in a position where I was taking the arguments that the brothers have put forward, Brother Muhammad Hijab and Brother Hamza also. So over the years, mashallah, I've done lots of work in terms of building the information that we need, the understanding that we need to help the Muslims combat these, but in a very academic way. And I found myself with the task of trying to distill this into the mind of an 11-year-old. And alhamdulillah, because of we've been involved in dawah for a very long time, mashallah, and our families have heard these interactions before. There was, mashallah, something to work with. But I ended up having to go through, because the question is very interesting. It not only asks you to prove what you believe or establish why you believe what you believe, but also asks you to understand the counter views. Why might some atheists disagree with you, for example? And so we did this, we ended up making a 3 paragraphs to make this sort of 8-mark answer. And I think what I then was contemplating was the other end of the spectrum. Are we actually giving our children or our youngsters at an earlier age the fundamental things, the tools they have in a language that they have accessible to them, to be able to then, when they come across these things, be able to discuss them in a way that they have a little bit of understanding and maybe a bit of authority in how they speak. So what were the things that I dealt with? And I think this probably goes to answering the question that you put, Brother Mansour. So we spoke about first declaring your position that that I believe that God exists, and then talking about why people may not believe God exists. And the first thing we spoke about is scientism. We didn't use the word scientism. We used the word, some people believe that science is the only way to know truth. And we spoke about what that meant and why this may be flawed. We then spoke about the problem of evil in one paragraph. I mean, subhanAllah, it was trying to get this distilled into that. We spoke about the problem of evil, why the problem of evil is not something that would detract from believing in God. And then the last thing was to talk about specifically about the idea of why you believe that God exists as a rational explanation for the existence of the universe. We didn't delve into specific religions, but for me, this raised another point that maybe in terms of our speaking, in terms of the dawah that we do, we need to broaden the access that we have in terms of the language that we use, so that people from a wide range of backgrounds and abilities can access the information and maybe benefit as a wider community. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that, inshallah.
Okay. Hamza and Hijab, you've got the hints already there. What Dr. Imran is pointing to here, there seems to be a massive indoctrination program going on from the very early age, exposing very young minds who haven't naturally been exposed to this kind of ideas. I mean, you would expect them to have this innate belief already, which is a natural disposition to believe in a higher power, a creator, but that seems to be now being stirred with this indoctrination programs around a very early stage, just like what you see beliefs about many other things within science, what they call evolution or otherwise, where from the very beginning this has been put to our children so that they're already questioning this, and eventually, of course, they'll have to succumb to the idea to come to and accept it or reject it, whichever it might be. So likewise, what I think Dr. Imran may be hinting to, if I'm not mistaken, is we need to also make our materials accessible to our youth in their own understanding, to their level. How do one believe in a creator? How do one believe in a God? How do one make sense of the reality? How do one understand the problem of evil, if there's such a thing? Because people make it into a problem, when for us, it's part of the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why the good and the bad exists. There is no such thing as a pure evil in that sense, because they are complementary. So do you think you are going to work on it, inshallah, both of you, to make material accessible? Because you have produced excellent materials over the years, and Muhammad Hijab is now writing books. We wish that you bring materials which are accessible to the very young, because now we see the targeting is on the young rather than the teenage population. What do you say, Hamza?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Apologies. I think what firstly, the way Muhammad Hijab articulated his initial statement was great. MashaAllah, tabarakallah. I agree with everything that he said, especially about liberalism. And what Dr. Imran said is actually on point, because from a practical point of view, what's happening is now a liberalization of the mindset of our children. And when you look at ideologies in general, you see that they have this kind of inbuilt mechanism to defend themselves. So they'll do that with their narratives. And it's even in our language. Like, for example, Mansour, you mentioned something about it's against our liberty, against our freedom. We've even adopted their language, thinking that Islam is against freedom. I'm not saying that you have, but it's subtle. But that's not the case at all, because these liberals, they don't even study the idea of freedom in a philosophical academic sense. And when you do study it, what it is, it's not just an absence of coercion, but rather it's about a violation of your rights. And if you have a liberal understanding of rights, then fine. Anything against that is against freedom. But the question is, who defines rights? and that's an academic paper that we produce on Sapiens Institute to discuss, like, does Islam really go against your freedom? No, because the one who has the right to give us our rights is the one who created us. And as long as those are in place, then by virtue of that, you're not in a state of coercion, right? And you should read the book by, I think his name was Whiteheimer. It's called Coercion. It's a phenomenal book. Anyway, moving away from that, what Imran said is really true. So I think what I was thinking now was, like, for example, I've written the book, The Divine Reality, God, Islam, the Mirage of Atheism. It's free on Sapiens Institute, free to download. To do a kids version, to do a version for like 7 to 12-year-olds. And it can be done because you could basically get some money together, hire a ghostwriter and say to them, look, your job is to keep the content, but address it to this mindset. So this is what the community need to do. We need to get together to produce this type of material. Notwithstanding, I think it's important not to be reactionary, because we have inbuilt tools traditionally in the Islamic tradition that if we revive a orthodox, classical, mainstream, balanced education at home, we won't need to deal with these. We already have given the kind of spiritual and intellectual tools to our children that can navigate this space. For example, if children know why Allah is worthy of worship at home, if children, study, like, for example, basic creedal texts, if children, for example, have a good, close relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if children, their parents are in a position to answer the questions such as why this and why that, if you create a loving home and you introduce the key orthodox, mainstream, child-friendly educational concepts at home, that will be enough, I think, that they can navigate this space. So we shouldn't be reactionary that we have to have an answer for this, an answer for that. Yes, we do have answers for sure. But as a foundational point of view, not only must we have material that can address the children or address youth or make it more accessible for people, but we should also at the same time teach our community the power of our tradition. Our intellectual, spiritual tradition is so powerful. I have this view that if we teach our children why Allah is worthy of worship, we teach our children to have a close relationship with God, with Allah. We teach our children the basic foundational creedal principles in our tradition. For example, God's names and attributes and all of this stuff. And they have a close connection with the Quran, then they would have enough to navigate this space. And if they're in a position where they don't know how to answer a question, they could come back to their loving parents and ask. And then you could have that conversation, and then we could use the other materials. So it's not just about having materials. We have to really create a new, revive a culture within our homes, because generally speaking, in the kind of Muslim community, sometimes in the Asian subcontinent community, it's very much do's and don'ts, and it's more, Islam has become like this social identity. It's like a hat that you wear, but rather it's not something that affects how you relate with yourself and how you relate with others. It doesn't affect your state of being. And that is because of the way we're taught Islam at home. It's like, okay, you're Muslim, this is what you believe. This is the 5 pillars, just go and do it. But rather, and alhamdulillah, there's a lot of great stuff happening in our communities, but we need to revive that kind of educational practice at home as well, I believe. So, yeah.
So Muhammad Hijab, the point is there, revival at home. But the revival starts with knowledge, right?
Yeah, but I just wanted to comment on the points that were made. I think that it's important that we have organizations with specialisms. All right, so at Sapiens, we have a very, very kind of specific focus, which is to handle academic discussions or navigate the space in that kind of area. And I feel like for us to trespass into the area of pedagogy, but not only pedagogy, but early year pedagogy, would be us doing a disservice to that particular space, because it's not our forte. It's not something we're actually specialists in. What can happen is that there can be collaborative efforts between us and those experts who are not only trained in pedagogical, this word means basically learning approaches. Pedagogy means learning approaches for young people. So pedagogical approaches at the early ages. If someone has a basic understanding of the discourses that we're having, that we're having in terms of atheism and so on, and also has a very strong background, for example, in primary school education, right? And can somehow scaffold the information that we have presented in that way with our permission or with our collaboration, that would be much more effective, I believe, than us trying to perform or to specialize almost in an area that we can't specialize in, and it's not our area. So
Yeah.
I think that's important. That's one area. That's one point of importance. The second point is, in terms of what we're trying to present now, is, I mean, Ibn Qudam al-Maqdisi, who's mutawassit, like a medieval, if you like, Hanbali scholar. He produced 3 books, actually, in fiqh, in jurisprudence. One of them is called Umdat al-Fiqh, and then al-Kafi. Yeah, actually 4, but then al-Mughni after. These are the 3 main ones. There's a 4th one in there, right? Al-Mughni is the biggest. It's like a compendium, if you like, or magnum opus, or whatever you want to call it. It's a massive book. But actually, with the smallest and most basic one, he said it took him the most time to do that, which is Umdat al-Fiqh. Because in order to abbreviate all of the most important information into the most decisive and concise text was the most difficult thing for him to do. And so sometimes we have to kind of reverse engineer the process. We have to start with the big ideas and then refine it back down into this, how to abbreviate it, how to convey that to different audiences, and so on. Ibn Taymiyyah, he mentions in a book he writes called Mas'alat Huduth al-Alam. It's a very interesting book. I don't think many people know about this book, actually. It's basically a book about how the universe began. It's what Ibn Taymiyyah actually writes a book called Mas'alat Huduth al-Alam, how the universe, or the issue of how the universe began. He has a whole book to it, dedicated to the topic. And in the very introductory chapter of this, and by the way, there is disputed authorship, but the majority of scholars say that he done this, and most of the manuscripts say it's his. So anyway, he says in the very first chapter, and this really struck me when I first read it, he said that there are many arguments for God's existence, right? This is what he said, but he said we don't need them. He said most people don't need them. He said the Quranic argument, which is were they created from nothing, or were they themselves the creators of themselves, and so on. That just that sentence itself, that tripartite choice, is it from nothing, or is it did the universe create itself, or did you create yourselves, and so on. That will be enough to satisfy the majority of people. He said that will be enough. This by itself will be enough to satisfy the majority of people. So for example, if you were talking to your daughter, I'm not a early year specialist, though I did teach year 7s for some time, right? I'd say, well, did the universe come from nothing, or did it, the things that you see, you can actually explain that to you, I think, year 7, right? It will take a little bit of time, but it can be done. So that would, I believe, satisfy the majority of, from my experience, and I think from Hamza's as well, it satisfies the majority of people with doubts. It satisfies the majority of people who are monotheists generally, that the universe couldn't come from nothing, these kinds of things, that it couldn't have created itself, and so by a process of elimination, theism makes sense, that kind of thing, right? Which comes from the Quran. Ibn Taymiyyah says that's enough, but if there's a requirement, he says this in another book, actually. Yeah, it's called Ar-Radd al-Mantiqiyin, the reply to the Greek logicians. He says that if there's a requirement, we can engage in these kinds of discourses. Now, that's the space which we are trying to fill, that point there, where there's a requirement now, because the requirement has become more widespread because of education, because people have now become, because of globalization, because of the internet age, all of these things. So the requirement has become more pressing for us to have to deal with these matters. So that's the space we're filling. But in terms of the other space, the pedagogical space, that would require, I believe, a collaborative effort with Muslim teachers who have specialism many years in early year, because there's differences, right? There's early year pedagogy, right? From year 7 to 12, and that understand the concepts and are willing to scaffold and differentiate and do all the things teachers do, and produce robust syllabi and ghostwrite, like Hamza says, all these things for children ages maybe 7 to 12, as mentioned.
Mansoor, just to add to that, very short, I totally agree. In no way was I insinuating academic type institutes to now become early years specialists. That's not the case at all. Is to highlight that such institutes and organizations are so important. So when they produce the high level work, it could then filter down throughout our community, and we could create collaborative connections and relationships with other specialists in early years that could take that work and make it more digestible, just like what they do in a secular liberal world, in for example, in the UK and in the West, you have all these academics writing about evolution and science, all of that stuff. Then it just filters down all the way down to the early years. So that's a very similar approach that we're going to be taking. But I just want to bring everything back to the topic.
Yeah.
Let's just be very honest here. Atheism doesn't make sense. Specifically, philosophical naturalism doesn't make sense because you can't explain rationality. You can't explain necessary logical connections, which is a part of rationality, logical reasoning. You can't explain truth as a moral value. Truth as a moral value is fundamentally undermined under philosophical naturalism. You can't explain the contingency of the universe. You can't explain meaning, and you can't explain consciousness, in particular phenomenal consciousness in a subjective conscious states. So you can't explain the origins of the universe. And there was one more thing: you can't even explain objective moral values and objective moral truths. Moral values and moral truths are slightly different, and we could unpack that a bit later. But the point is, atheism doesn't make sense for all of these reasons, and hopefully we can unpack some of this throughout our discussion today, inshallah.
Okay, so we need to invite our atheist friends and guests to join us and defend these positions, whether you really think atheism is rational. Because as you just highlighted with a few of these points, atheism is not rational. So we would like to bring guests who would really defend them. This is your opportunity. The challenge is out there, and you need to defend those positions, because it's not that, okay, the theists and the believers have to always defend their theism. Atheism also needs to be defended, because this is an idea or a concept which is, as we are discussing, is irrational. So let's take some of our guests who have joined. I just need to know the names on the screen without their logo, if you don't mind, admin. Okay, let's take A, which is quite simple. Welcome to our show. Tell us what you believe, and do you agree with this position? This is Malik, of course, most likely to be a Muslim.
So can you guys hear me?
Yeah, is that you, Malik?
Yes, that would be me. Assalamu alaikum again, guys.
Wa alaikum salam.
Rahmatullah.
So obviously, I've already informed everybody that I'm an ex-atheist, ex-agnostic, and one thing that I could never deny in terms of the rationality argument for the existence of God is the original cause, the very first cause. Just from the rational point of view that an infinite chain of events cannot go into the past. It has to begin somewhere so that the current moment is possible. Where I think the atheists really go wrong, and even the agnostics, is the argument that I don't have enough evidence and I have no idea what would be evidence.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Jazak Allah Khair. Stay there. We might have some other discussions with our atheist friends if they join in. But I want to go to Adrian.
Hello.
Hi there. Tell us where you're joining from, and do you have a faith or a belief system?
Well, I'm from Romania. By the way, hello Hajar, if you're watching. What is my position? Basically, I'm an agnostic atheist. I think everyone needs to provide evidence for their claims. So if I claim that a God doesn't exist, then I have the duty to provide evidence for that. And there is no such evidence. So I think it's irrational to claim positively that there is no God.
So on that note, I'm glad you followed my comments with exactly that. What exactly will you accept as evidence?
Well, I'm not sure. That's the thing. It have to make sense first and foremost. And
okay,
I would like to take this opportunity to actually talk a bit about the cosmological argument, if you guys are okay with that, and to tell you what doesn't add up to me.
Go ahead. Sure.
All right. So if we follow the cosmological argument, it logically leads us to the conclusion of the first uncaused cause, because something coming out of nothing is simply illogical, and so is infinite regress. So we're just left with the first uncaused cause. However, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, because if the first cause always existed and never began to exist, that means an infinite amount of time has already passed. But if it passed, it cannot really be infinite, since you cannot reach or pass infinity.
So here's the problem.
Okay.
Here's the problem. Within
sorry, Brother
is
Malik, if you don't mind. Brother Malik, if you don't mind, can we just hear Adrian a bit more in terms of his position and understanding of this subject, and then we will take in turns and see how we can help address that point. So Adrian, please carry on.
All right. So this idea that something always existed, to me at least, it sounds just like an infinite regress, because it has to go back in time forever. And if it goes back in time forever, how did we get to the present point in time? That's what I cannot wrap my head around.
Okay. Well, I start with the Hamza first, if you don't mind, addressing the point, and we'll go to Hijab.
Adrian, that's a very good question. Firstly, I'm very happy that you've accepted the fact that, you know, something coming from nothing is absurd. And what we mean by nothing is no prior causal connections. It means there is no thing at all. And so, no prior causal conditions. There is no thing at all. And for something to come, something cannot come from that. That's just totally irrational. And when you look at the logical reverse of that, it just leads, it renders so many things absurd, which we could unpack later. So I'm happy about that. The second thing is, you're happy about you kind of infinite regress of causes. So what I've understood from your question, and please interrupt me if I've misunderstood what you said, is that fine, there must be a first cause, but the problem is, if there was a first uncaused cause, then the uncaused cause must have been there for an infinite amount of time. But we said the infinite regress of causes is impossible. So therefore, how can you have an infinite amount of time? Because an infinite amount of time, what you're saying, necessarily leads to an infinite regress. Is that correct?
Yes. I think that's it.
Okay, good. So Adrian, let me just try and show you why there are some confusions in what you're saying, okay? And again, if I'm saying anything that's wrong, if I misrepresent you, just butt in straight away and let me know. So the first thing, the reason we believe the infinite regress of causes is absurd is not necessarily because of the concept of infinite. It's because of causes being there forever. It's because there are more than one discrete thing that is connected causally to another discrete thing ad infinitum. That is the problem, not necessarily the concept of the infinity. Also, when you say that how can you have an infinite time, there must have an infinite regress, you have to now show that there is more than one discrete thing that is causally connected in some way. But if there's one uncaused cause, then all you could say is, well, you have an undifferentiated infinite, which is not a problem. Because remember, when the argument talks about the absurdity of infinite regress of causes or events, it tries to show, especially when you talk about the events, that the infinity doesn't make sense in the real world. But in what sense? In a differentiated sense. So when we say we don't believe in the infinity, we don't say we don't believe in all types of infinity. We say that the differentiated infinite doesn't make sense. So what is the differentiated infinite? The differentiated infinite is when you have physical discrete things. So you have an infinite made up of physical discrete things. That's the thing that we're saying is absurd, and we could have so many different thought experiments to show that. However, you're conflating the differentiated infinite with the undifferentiated infinite. The undifferentiated infinite is not a problem, right? Because when you come to the concept of God or the concept of the uncreated creator or the uncaused cause, that is what you would call an undifferentiated infinite, because it's not made up of physical discrete parts, and they're not causally connected in any way. So you have to do maybe a little bit more reading on the difference between these two types on infinite. So there's nothing logically problematic about what you're saying. You just, I think, confusing between the differentiated infinite with the undifferentiated infinite. The other thing I want to say, which is a little bit more simple, and I'll end on this, and it's the words of Professor Abraham Varghese. It's in the appendix to Professor Anthony Fleur's book, There Is a God. He makes a brilliant point. He says, look, atheists and theists have to agree on something. That something was always there, right? It's either the universe or it's God. So since we know the universe must have began because it's contingent and all the other evidence that we have, well, we have very good reason to believe that God is the eternal thing in a very simple way. So, Adrian, have you understood what I've said so far?
I think so, but I just feel there's something unaddressed here.
Okay.
And maybe I'm wrong, but I'll just say it anyway. So in my head at least, why I have a serious problem with the infinite regress is because if the number of causes is infinite and it doesn't have a starting point anywhere, well, if it doesn't have a starting point, then it's impossible to get anywhere, since every cause is basically contingent on the previous cause.
Yep.
And it's something similar with the idea of something always existed. Because if it doesn't begin anywhere, then how can it get to any point in time? Maybe. Maybe it's just me and I just cannot get my head around it.
No, not at all. It's just, think about what I said about the causal relations. We're having a problem that many things cannot be causally related ad infinitum. When you're saying there is a sole cause for the universe, and now that sole cause has been existing since for eternity, that is fundamentally different, because that sole cause is not in a type of discrete causal relation for infinity. It's just itself uncaused. Does that make sense? So there is a fundamental difference between the type of problem that you're postulating and the issue that you're trying to show with the uncaused cause. Because the uncaused cause doesn't have that problem of an infinite regress, because what is this cause relating to ad infinitum, if that makes sense? Yeah, it's always been there. Then it brings the universe. It brings the universe into existence. It brought the universe into existence. I don't think "brings" is even an English word. So, however, there is another issue here concerning notions of time and what type of time you're talking about. But I just want you to really highlight in your head. Okay, so why do we disagree with the infinite regress of causes? Exactly what you said. Yeah, the reasons that you postulate are true. Now, we can't use the same thing when we apply it to the uncaused cause, because now we're talking about a different type of an infinity, and we're not actually even talking about a regress. That's the issue in the most simplest sense.
Jazak Allah Khair. Muhammad Ijab, I believe you have a clip on this issue, but anyway, would you like to address this point in a different way or add something to it?
I think Hamza is completely right, because in the cosmological sense, from my understanding of the arguments made in the medieval period, most theorists made this point that there's a difference between infinity of things, anything in particular, and infinity of causes. This is how I would simplify it that way. So basically, there's a difference between pre-eternity, because what we're talking about here, correct me if I'm wrong, Adrian, yeah. But you're saying that if there's a pre-eternity, then there's so there is eternity to the past. That's infinity to the past, right?
Yes.
So you're finding that that part is there inconceivable. That there was a pre-eternity. What we're saying is that the theorists that make the cosmological argument are not making this point, that there could be a pre-eternity is inconceivable, because in fact Ibn Taymiyyah didn't make this argument. He said that there was a pre-eternity to the past. Ibn Sina made the argument there was a pre-eternity. So many of the theorists believe that there was a pre-eternity to the past. I personally don't believe that for theological reasons, but on logical grounds, I don't see the issue with infinity to the past. Just like we believe as Muslims, right, that when people go to heaven or hell, they're going to stay there forever. Okay, they're going to stay there. So it's eternity to the future. So this is called post-eternity. So you have pre-eternity and you have post-eternity. The idea of eternity to the past or the future in terms of time and things, I don't think is a ludicrous idea. I don't think that is irrational. Because why? On what grounds is that irrational? That there's going to things are going to continue happening for forever, either to the past or to the future. I don't think. Why is that irrational? Things are going to continue happening. Events happening. That's not irrational. The point that the theorists made was that you can't have an infinite regress, and underline this point, of causes.
Yes.
Of causes. Yeah. So this is the argument. The argument is not you can't have an infinite regress of time or of things or of whatever it is, godly actions or post eternity of people residing in the hellfire or residing in heaven, which we believe as Muslims will happen. Yeah.
Right.
We're saying that the only thing which is ludicrous and impossible is that you can't have an infinite regress of causes, and of causes here means a cause is defined as something which brings rise to phenomena. You can't have something which brings rise to phenomena, bringing rise to phenomena ad infinitum, because that would be absurdity. That's ridiculous. That's impossible. That's logically inconceivable. Yeah. So that's what is logically inconceivable, to have something which brings rise to something which brings rise to something which brings rise to something.
And you go like this forever,
That's impossible. But that you can have, let's say, infinite time or whatever it is, I don't think that's irrational. I don't think that's that's logical. That these are the distinctions we're trying to make here, I think.
Yeah, and that's why Adrian. Sorry,
I might just go and pray Maghrib. Sorry. Sorry.
Sure.
If that's okay. Sorry, I'll be back. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. So I'm gonna make this point, and I'll be back too. So Adrian, I think Hijab put it simply. You just need to ask yourself the question: where is the regress of causes when there is just an uncaused cause?
There is no regress in that case.
Exactly. Beautiful. So since there's no regress, then you can't say, oh, there's an absurdity here. There's the absurdity of an infinite regress of something. There isn't. Now, if you say, well, there's an absurdity of the infinite regress of time, but what does that actually mean? Because one could postulate an undifferentiated time, right? In that sense. So just think about this. Is there an infinite regress with the uncaused cause? If there isn't, then your question doesn't necessarily apply. Does that make sense, Adrian?
Sure. Look, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna rewatch your explanation as many times as needed. And if I think there's still a problem, who knows, maybe next time when you do a live show, I'll come in and
it doesn't have
talk
to be
about
live. You could email us on info@sapiensinstitute.org.
Oh, okay.
Others, just contact us directly, and just let's continue the conversation. I think you're there, bro. I think you're there. I think you're gonna come to the conclusion. There is an uncaused cause that makes sense of God for so many conceptual reasons. And inshallah, we'll take it from there. But I really like the discussion, the dialogue. Me too. Just please. Even you can email SCDawah@gmail.com. And if they want, they could pass the question over, or they could answer it themselves, or you could go straight to info@sapiensinstitute.org. Thank you, Adrian. I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes, inshallah.
Yeah. Brother Malik, we kept you there. I'm sure you were just trying to see how you can help Brother Adrian back in there. So yeah, over to you just to make some points, and then I will let Brother Imran to moderate the house for a while I go to pray Maghrib as well, inshallah, and then it'll be your turn if you don't mind. So Brother Malik, yes, if you want to make some points.
So Adrian, now I'm very glad you brought this up, because I myself, as an atheist, had the same, I was dealing with the same conundrum. The uncaused cause, which rationally I can say exists, and really there's no way to get past that. Has to be, logically. Now, the problem that you're having with the infinite regress is the nature of time and its interaction with the uncaused cause. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, and there's a bit more to it, actually. It's the fact that, for example, minute number 5 is contingent on minute number 2. I mean, you have to get to minute number 2 to get to 3 and 4 and 5 and so on and so forth. So
yeah, so I'll tell you, Adrian, like this issue is something I dealt with for years. And one thing we've got to realize is when we're asking certain questions, there are presuppositions attached to it. And when we go down this line, the way you are and the way I have, is we are presupposing the eternality of time, right?
Yeah.
We are not looking at the possibility that the time itself is caused by the uncaused cause. This issue, this conundrum is only a conundrum if we are saying that the uncaused cause is itself subject to time. But if we remove that dependency, if we remove the uncaused cause and say that time itself is a cause, is caused, then we can have a beginning of time which removes the infinite regress of time. Does that make sense?
Yes, and actually, I've heard this many times, that it necessarily follows that the first cause must be outside of space and outside of time and outside of anything material, actually. So of course, we get to this conclusion. However, here I got another problem, but I just didn't want to be a machine gun of questions. You know, I want to leave some space for the other participants here to ask their questions. But if you're if the first cause existed before time and it caused time to exist, well, I cannot get my head around that either, because in order to perform any action, time is required. So when did it have the time to perform the action of creating time? Does that make sense?
Right. So you're talking about a time before time, like I guess like a concept of
Kind
time
of.
that we would not be able to understand.
Sure. I mean, I guess I cannot get my head around the idea that an action can be performed outside of time, because what is that? I mean,
So if I could maybe jump in
Sure.
for a moment. So it's an interesting question, Adrian, that you're asking. And I think one of the ways of looking at it is actually to do an analysis of what the things that you've understood so far mean for what this uncaused cause would be in terms of the qualities or the properties that it would have. So if this uncaused cause is the thing that caused the universe, and Brother Hamza was talking about the differentiating between differentiated causes and undifferentiated causes. Now the universe itself is, we know, time and space. Yeah, it's together. So time then in that sense had a beginning of this. Now if you take something that is timeless, so now automatically you can say a few things. This cause is immaterial,
Correct.
because material is something that was caused, and outside of time, i.e. timeless, because time is also something that was caused. The question then, I think your question then becomes, well, how then does something that's atemporal, like outside of time, bring about a temporal effect? So what that, I think, if you look at this, I think what this, the only conclusion that when I'm thinking about this similar thing is that I can come to, and I'm sure the brothers will sort of fill in whenever they're back from their slides, that it necessitates that the uncaused cause has to have volition, intention, to bring something that's an undifferentiated infinite brings about something that's finite. Then there's no causes acting on that undifferentiated infinite. So i.e. there's nothing causing the uncaused cause to do things. Therefore, when it does do that thing, that is something it does out of volition. So this is necessarily something that we have to then attribute to that thing. So we have a immaterial, timeless, and something with will in terms of describing the uncaused cause. So I think that might go to explain how that happens. Now, how an action once you create a temporal effect, you bring about the beginning of the universe, then time and everything would begin from that very moment. So there's not really a separation of events outside of time, because that moment is instantaneous as soon as the universe is initiated.
I see. So you're saying that the action of the first cause creating time is not before time itself, temporarily speaking, but just causally speaking.
That's how I'm saying it. Yeah. But my brother Hijab is here. I'm also going to go and pray. Inshallah, I'll be back in a few moments.
So do you want to just, Adrian, do you want to just briefly, explain your question to Muhammad Hijab about these issues of time?
Sure. So what I said is that it logically follows that this first cause has to be outside of time and outside of space and immaterial. And if it's outside of time and it caused time to exist, that means it existed before time. And what I'm saying is that in order to perform any action, time is required for that. So when did the first cause have the time to perform the action of creating time, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It does make sense. But the point of, in order for any action to be created or to be put into existence, it has to be done within time. I think that would be the point of difference here, because I don't think that's a requirement.
Yes, agreed.
Okay.
Because you have, if you
why is that? Yeah, why is it a requirement?
Yeah, very good, Hijab. So, Adrian, what we need to understand as well here is you're trying to make a necessary connection between action, causation, and time. Now, in Western philosophy, for example, they don't even have a consensus on the nature of the causal relation, right? They wouldn't even dare to say that here is a definition. Like, if you study on a postgraduate level, you'd be like, oh my God, that's why I was like, I didn't even get involved in it because it was just messy, right? Okay. Now, there's papers to this day that still debate and discuss the nature of the causal relation, but there's something that you need to appreciate here. Conceptually, is there a problem that you can have a cause that exists atemporally, but it also is so you have an effect that exists outside of time, but it is prior causally. Now, conceptually, this is called asymmetric causality. It is not necessarily a problem. Let me give you a thought experiment. It's a Kantian thought experiment. So say, for example, you have an eternal ball and eternal pillow, right? Let me get my pillow.
Okay.
Lo and behold, we have a pillow here, right? So imagine, just for the sake of the analogy, let's not damn the analogy because that is a logical fallacy. We don't. And this is a ball. Imagine this is a ball. It's a moisture-rich sourdough for now, but imagine it's a ball. Now it's the pillow. The ball is eternal. The pillow is eternal. What is the causal relation between the ball and the pillow? In terms of the indentation, there is a dent. It's called an indentation, I think. There's a dent in the pillow. Now, the dent in the pillow, right? Is that caused by the ball? Yes. But there's no time because they're both eternal. So it exists, the ball exists prior causally, but not prior in time. Rather, the dent exists prior in time. Sorry, exists atemporally without time, but prior causally.
I see.
Or rather, the ball exists prior causally in this instance, yeah? So from a conceptual, logical, coherent point of view, there is nothing necessarily incoherent with the notion of asymmetric causality from that issue, yeah? So notwithstanding what you've said, notwithstanding what I've just said, how do you get that? Does that thought experiment make any sense to you?
Well, yes, and I'm surprised I haven't really heard about it.
Okay, good. So the other thing you need to realize is this. Just imagine from a Big Bang cosmological sense. Now, generally speaking, there is an agreement that there is a boundary to the universe. Yes, there is some disagreement about a boundary, but there's no consensus. We don't have to unpack that for now. Say there is a boundary to the universe. At the boundary, bro, time is zero.
Yes, okay.
There's no time. Okay. Are we saying now there's no causal relation between the universe and the boundary?
No, of course not.
There you go, man.
Okay, okay.
The reason I'm laughing is I don't know why I'm laughing. Maybe because I'm hungry. But the point is, when you get that point, then it starts to show that this contention is actually not an undercutting defeatist. So let me give you some advice, because we've spoken about a lot of things. And to be honest, I truly do believe, and I'm going to just be honest with you, be trying to be as authentic as possible.
Okay.
I don't believe the issue of time, differentiate time, undifferentiated time, the A theory, the B theory, asymmetric causality, instantaneous causality, all of that stuff. I don't really, if we remove the kind of, intellectual stuff, I don't think that's the main problem here. I don't know. I just suggest humbly stand in the possibility that not having answers to these questions are not necessarily, having answers to these questions are not something that you actually require for you to agree that there is a creator for the heavens and the earth. Just stand in that possibility. I'm not saying it's the case. I don't want to come across as arrogant.
Oh, but hold on. I've always acknowledged that possibility.
Good.
I told you from the beginning that I'm not like a positive atheist or something like that. I don't claim that there is no God. I'm just not convinced. That's all. But I acknowledge the possibility always.
But even in the case of conviction, I would say that try and explore just further. Maybe you have, but just re-explore that these not answering these questions do not really become a huge barrier against being convinced that there is a creator. That's what I would say. Yeah, that's what I would say. That would be my kind of psychological approach to this whole thing, because I want to now logically follow with everything else, right? Because you could apply the same type of questioning to the fact that me and you are having a conversation. In actual fact, we've spent more time philosophically unpacking these ideas than the idea that me and you really exist in the real world, or the idea of all the other presuppositions that we hold. Because if we apply this type of questioning and this type of skepticism or agnosticism that we're applying to causality and we're applying to time and infinite regress, and we just be consistent and we apply the same type of philosophical investigation and maybe pedantry, if you want to use such a word, and we apply that to things like me and you existing in the real world. It's not just idealism. It's not just in our minds, or the fact that we have rational minds, because the presupposition between me and you now is that we have rational minds that will come to a certain conclusion. So I want you to explore that. And if it's not entirely consistent, then maybe there are other dimensions within our own selves that is basically providing a psychological and emotional driver to maybe not admit a particular truth. That's what I'm saying. Because if we were to use the same type of skepticism or agnosticism on many other things that we believe to be true, that we're convinced in, then it would render reality absurd. So since that consistency we can't do by virtue of the inevitable absurdity, that might be an indication that there is a maybe psychological, emotional, existential driving force that we haven't explored yet that is preventing us to be convinced. That is my position. Does that make sense, Adrian?
Sure. And look, I've never said that I need to have 100% certainty. I mean, the only thing I can have 100% certainty about is the fact that I exist. Anything else, there's no 100% certainty. I just want a reasonable certainty. That's all.
Well, you know what, bro? If we were to apply our philosophical questioning on even the word I, then I don't think you'd be certain after this conversation, because you could even still argue, what is I? Are you really conscious? Maybe it's illusion. It's an illusion. Maybe.
Sure, you can go like this forever, I guess.
Absolutely. So by virtue of that, I think that can help you and even me and everybody explore and standing the possibility that there are non-rational aspects to the self that may be skewing or skewing our path towards a particular truth. Because we're human beings, bro. You know, you're Romanian, I'm Greek. I don't know if you're Orthodox. You came from an Orthodox background.
Yes.
You know, Greek, sometimes we have a a historical complex, right? We're so
Yes.
great, and look what happened.
I know.
The other, and we have a lot of Eurocentrism sometimes, and there's so many, and even the way we're brought up, sometimes we have a superiority complex. So from that point of view, these things can skew our positions, and we may use certain questions as the vehicle that's driving us down the path of skepticism and agnosticism. But in actual fact, we need to sometimes have these frank conversations and be authentic and say, you know what, human beings have biases all the time, emotional, psychological, spiritual biases. And the way to expose those biases is to ask what I've been asking now. If we apply the same form of hair splitting to all the other things that we believe to be true, even your own question of I exist, reality is absurd. By virtue of that, we have an epistemic and moral duty to investigate that there are other things going on in the self. So this is why I advise you to even read the Quran. Yeah. Forget all this philosophical.
I've actually read a good chunk of it. Of course, not all of it. I still have a lot.
But this is my advice on how to read it. Read it with reflection. Like, ask yourself, what is being said to me here? If we read it with reflection in that way, I think it will provide a powerful tool to uncover some things within us, because I really believe you don't read the Quran actually reads you, and you will find yourself in there. So go on that journey. You've got our email addresses. Please be in touch. And we're going to get back in touch with you, Adrian. It's been a huge, immense pleasure to engage with you, man.
Well, it's been great. Very productive interaction, I'd say.
Absolutely. Yeah. Pleasure having you here, Adrian, and do tune in other shows and join us in the conversation. So it's been a real pleasure speaking to you.
All right, guys.
Now,
take care. Have a good one.
Take care.
You too. Now we're going to go to Carlos. Welcome to our show. If I am not mistaken, do you not believe in God? Or are you an atheist?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've been on before, so thanks for having me on again. I've been listening since the start of the show, so I've been enjoying the conversation and different perspectives. So it's been really interesting. So as you can guess, I am an atheist, or I would be considered one in this discussion. And for me, I think at the start, Mansour, you said that atheism is an ideology. And that's something that I would disagree with, because how I understand atheism, and maybe I don't speak for all atheists, but how I understand it is that I'm not convinced by a particular theist claims, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. So that's all I'm basically saying, and there's nothing more than that, really. So it's the same as someone saying that they believe fairies exist, and me saying I'm not convinced that fairies exist. I see it in the same way. Maybe you guys don't because of our difference in worldviews. That might be the reason why, but that's the reason I disagree with that. And I don't. And for the same reasons, I don't think that position that I take needs to have explanatory power. I think that if you're making a claim of any sort, then that's what needs to have explanatory power. Really, I mean, for me, if I do have any explanatory power at all, then I personally would say that I have to use logic to sort of disregard the position of the claim that's being made, or something along those lines. But as an atheist, I'm not saying that no gods exist, and I'm prepared to change my mind if the evidence takes me in that direction, and I'm always open to listening to different perspectives. I think for me as an atheist, I'll say on the theist side, the Kalam cosmological argument or the contingency argument is probably hands down the best argument in terms of people that believe in God. But I don't necessarily think it has to be a theistic God in terms of a specific religion. It could refer to deistic type of God or pantheistic, or it doesn't, when we talk about an uncaused cause, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a conscious one. I mean, you're assuming that it has to be conscious. I think if there's possibilities for it to be something else, then we need to either say that it's plausible and explain why it's plausible, or rule it out using logic, and then come to an answer at the end of it. But if there's other possibilities out there, such as the cause of the universe being contingent and contingent before that, and it's outside of our knowledge, if we don't know that, then we have to sort of sit on the fence and keep looking for those answers rather than assume that we know. And I think that's the difference for me between atheism and theism, because theism says that we know the answer, we stop looking for the answer, whereas I believe that we just live in an era where we don't understand everything about the world, we don't understand everything about the cause of the universe and things like that, and we're still learning. You look back 1,000 years and what they knew back then compared to what we know now. It's just unfortunate we're born in an era where we don't know everything, and I'm happy to say on certain things that I don't know, or maybe I can't know, but I'm not going to assume that I do know. I'm going to keep looking for the answer. So that's what I have to say.
Okay. Carlos, sorry.
Hands up, go ahead.
Carlos, thank you for your point. It was very articulate and very polite. Thank you. Carlos, it's good that you came back as well. It means that you have an affinity with the channel, which is really good. You're having a positive relation. You're in a state of being where you're positively relating to the channel and maybe to us, which is good. That's a really good. We take it as a thorough compliment. We'll squeeze as much credit as possible from that one. Yeah. So the point is, Carlos, see, there are a few things we need to unpack in your discourse, right? Because I agree that there's some things that we're never going to know. There's some things that are not knowable. But I think maybe subconsciously and even intellectually, you're assuming something, because there is a fundamental difference between metaphysics and the physics, if you like. Like, for instance, would you say that, evolution is true? Would you say it's true for you? Or actually, forget that. You give me something you believe to be true that's scientific. That's a scientific theory or conclusion.
Well, I believe evolution is an observable fact. We can see it.
Okay, good. Okay, so now the interesting thing here is, now when it comes to evolution, interestingly, there are so many metaphysical things at play. From the point of view, there are a lot of philosophical assumptions and presuppositions that you cannot prove that are required in order for evolution to be true. Because when scientists talk about truth, they never talk about truth with a capital T. They talk about truth with a small t, in its italics, because they know the Darwinian mechanism or evolution, for example, is fundamentally based on the inductive inference, which means that there can be another observation in the future that can contradict our current conclusions. Even the evangelical great fiction writer Richard Dawkins, he says in his book A Devil's Chaplain that we may have evidence in the future that would change Darwinism, or we will reject it altogether. The reason he's saying this, because he has to be close to his academia, to the academic world, because we know that there can be another observation that fundamentally contradicts our previous conclusions. That's the first point. And that is a philosophical point. Yeah. The second point is, in the philosophy of biology, you could refer to Professor Michael Rules, Professor Elliot Sober, and others. You would see that there are philosophical assumptions that science cannot prove, but are required in order for evolution to be true with a small t. One of those philosophical assumptions is called gradualism. Another philosophical assumption within the scientific paradigm is what you would call that nature is uniform. You have to have that assumption in order for you to even say evolution is true. Let me explain why. Scientists have to agree that, or hold the presupposition that they can't prove that nature is uniform, because if they didn't hold it, then they can't say that well-confirmed scientific theories can be applied to all phenomena. Because the Darwinian mechanism of evolution as we know it today, yes, it's well-confirmed according to scientists, yes, it has predictive power, but the problem is it hasn't seen all the evidence. For example, we haven't seen all of biological change. We have only seen 5% of the ocean. But because it's got predictive power, is well confirmed, and because of the philosophical unproven assumption that nature is uniform, then they can say that now evolution or Darwinian mechanism explains all of biological phenomena. I know that took time to unpack, but do you appreciate from what I've just said that even when you're saying some things are true or a fact, they're actually based on assumptions that you can't even prove?
Not totally. I think there's some things that we can prove, that we can observe, and those are the things that I'm saying I believe are true.
Yes.
You know, and there's a difference between that and a theory. And theories, I agree, we may later discover something that contradicts, maybe.
Okay, let me
go on.
Just to interject, sorry, because I think you're misusing the word theory in a scientific sense here. Theory in a popular sense, yes, it's just someone's theory. It's just your idea of how to explain certain things. Theory in actually science is one of the highest epistemic value, meaning the value of truth is extremely high. Why? Because it's well confirmed empirically and it has predictive power. So when you say, I believe evolution is a fact, you're actually saying evolution as a scientific theory, which has a higher epistemic value, is a fact.
Yeah.
But the reason I wanted to use that to explore that even when you say something is a fact in a scientific sense, or something is known to be true in a scientific sense, it has other philosophical assumptions that it requires in order for it to make sense scientifically. And those philosophical assumptions cannot be proven. So the reason I wanted to say this to you is to show that even when you're saying something is a fact, it actually based on assumptions that you can't prove. So how do we now square the circle here? Well, the reason I wanted to bring this to you to just kind of enlighten you, because you were saying that there are some things that we cannot know, but when you apply that to and therefore I don't believe it to be true. But when you apply that same reasoning to something that you call a fact, in order for you to be consistent, you have to reject the well-confirmed scientific theory called the Darwinian mechanism. And I'm not suggesting you should do that, but what I'm suggesting here is to try and explore the way you're reasoning here. So let's go back to the metaphysics. There are some first principles that we can know to be true. Can we know them empirically? No. But there are some truths that you can't prove empirically. And that is something that you need to explore, because the minute you stand in the possibility there are truths that you can't prove empirically is the minute that when you start talking about contingency of God's existence, that becomes more plausible for you. And this is very important for you to highlight, because even in science, the things that you said are true, like evolution, for example, they require truths that cannot be proven empirically. For example, for science to work, you need to believe in causal relations. Causal relations cannot be seen. Yes, you see a cause and you see effect, but the causal relation, you cannot see it. And that is a metaphysical discussion to be had. It's a non-empirical discussion, and scientists accept a particular view of that to be true in order for science to make sense. Now, I've said all of this only for you to continue your intellectual journey so you can unpack further ideas, because the way you've approached this topic required that unpacking. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry for going too long.
No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, the way I understand a theory, or when I talk about a scientific theory, is that it's an explanation of the facts. Is that what you understand? Or are we not talking past each other here?
No, yeah, I agree. But the facts require explanation. That's the point. So when someone says evolution is a fact, in the sense that you're referring to, all you're saying is there's biological change. But what evolution is, in terms of the way we try and explain the fact, is in terms of the Darwinian mechanism, is that it explains biological change. No one disagrees with biological change. It's just the explanation of biological change that is what we call the evolution theory, or the well-confirmed theory that's called evolution.
Right. So there's parts of evolution that you can accept as a Muslim, but parts that you can't. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's a different topic, but just to quickly answer that, there are some observable facts, the observable facts that we accept. We accept the fact that there's biological change. No one disagrees with that. The disagreement...
And what about natural selection?
Well, even that's not hugely contentious. What we would say is...
Right. Sorry to interrupt you. That's how, when I talk about evolution is true, that's all I'm saying. So... change by mutation and and natural selection working together to create what we see today in terms of our diversity.
Which all requires the philosophical assumptions that I discussed with you. That's the point.
But I do agree with you that perhaps there are further truths or more accurate explanations of what we see in terms of life and diversity. But what I believe or what I accept in science is that the observable parts of evolution that we see, the mutation, the natural selection, those parts for me are true. And any explanation that we find in the future or that is out there to be found will only add to that rather than contradict it. That's the position I'm taking.
Yeah, I'm going to let other people get involved to make it more productive. But just want to say something. The minute you put in mutation in there, the minute you put natural selection in there, you're really now talking about an explanation for biological change. The minute you start having those explanations, all of the philosophical presuppositions that you cannot prove in that sense are required. Yeah, they're required. So, because if you're saying what explains all of biological change is X, Y, and Z, well, then you got the presupposition of nature's uniform. You also got the presupposition of all the other stuff, the basic understanding of causal relations. You still require non-empirical metaphysical truths, if you want to call them that, or assumptions that you can't prove empirically in order for what you believe to be true. Once you understand that properly, then when you talk about what we can know metaphysically and physically and all of the stuff that you mentioned in the beginning, you'll be able to unpack that in a more productive way. That's all I wanted to say, because when we do convey and we teach the philosophy of science, one of my specialist modules in my postgrad was philosophy of science. When you teach that to people, especially to atheists, agnostics, it really opens their mind. And they start to understand, you know what, there are truths out there that are non-empirical, that we can investigate. And we can't just say we don't know. Because if we apply that same logic to the things that we believe to be true in science, then we'll have to reject most of the science. That was the point I'm trying to make.
Sure.
But other people get involved.
Further back to your original point, Carlos, when you said, if there is an uncaused cause, why does it have to be a, personal cause, for example? Why not a deistic cause? Why not pantheistic, and so on? And in line with this, as you've just described, natural selection, what I understand nature to be something that is not conscious of itself, so an unconscious process, doing these things. So you're providing an alternative. So I want to now ask Hijab and Imran, both the brothers, if you don't mind, you can go first if you want. How do we see this? If there is an uncaused cause, why do you think this has to be a cause which is, as we described, not a deistic, who doesn't, get involved in any of the creation, but actually really a personal cause that we say, like God?
Well, I actually agree with Carlos on his point here, because from my understanding, Carlos said that, the argument from contingency or the argument from the cosmological argument doesn't necessarily churn results which point to a personal God per se. I would agree with that. I would say that you could argue that the arguments for contingency and the arguments for even the cosmological arguments, you could argue that they bring about a kind of deism. I mean, that's the minimum that it could bring about. That's not to say that's the only thing it brings about, but that's the minimum it brings about. So the kind of attributes that we have of God, is you could say, like you said, is pre-eternal, is the necessary being. Everything depends upon him. He depends upon nothing. That you can even bring knowledge into the equation through the theory of particularization and even will. And these are the kinds of attributes that you'd get from arguing what he called arguing from first principle method, right? And I would agree with him that this method is not intended, actually, it's not even intended to make you into a fully-fledged Muslim, right? So in other words, you're not going to, with the cosmological argument or the contingency argument, you're not going to come to the conclusion that God is most gracious, most merciful, which is what almost every chapter of the Quran, bar one, only one, start with, that God is most gracious, most merciful. He's the loving one. All of these attributes of God, which are in the Quran and sometimes also in the Bible and other books, You won't get that from the argument from first principle method. At that point, you'd have to make a scriptural argument. But the relevance of the argument in the first place is to take someone away from atheism and agnosticism. Because if someone, and you've agreed that these arguments are quite powerful in the first place, if you agree with the arguments and take that stance, then you're no longer really an atheist, and you're no longer really an agnostic. You're at least someone who's maybe a classical theist, maybe a deist, someone who believes in a higher power, like those people who have said in America, 90% of which said we believe in a higher power. You would fall into that category now. No longer you're an atheist or an agnostic. Now you'd have to hear a selection of religious arguments that are made from different people and different religions, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and whatever, and see which one of those fits mostly with the logic that you've heard in the first place, or you've come to with the arguing from first principle method, and which is generally more true. Because is it Carlos?
Yeah.
Yes, mate.
Yes, Carlos. You see, I think what Hamza's also was trying to point out to you is that we don't come to conclusions of certainty of many things. Some things that we have are axiomatic, are unprovable, right? But we believe in them because either they're self-evident or we have probabilistic reasoning. And I want you to bear these two things in mind. Either things are self-evident, yeah, like I exist and you exist. It's very difficult for me to prove that empirically, that I exist and you exist in that sense, as a self, like not just as a body and so on, but as a self. It's difficult. Or mathematics exists in the real world. It's empirically impossible to prove this. Or that the mind exists in the real world. It's important, you know. Time happened in the past. How can you prove that, right? How can you prove that empirically? So all of these things are difficult to prove. You see what I mean? Impossible sometimes to prove. However, what we're saying is, what we end up doing as human beings is we come to pretty certified conclusions based on two fundamental things. Either we see things as self-evident, and or we argue probabilistically, meaning we have a cumulative argument. Like, for example, if you're like DNA forensics guy, and you see, okay, this person's been killed, then you start seeing the evidence. Okay, you know, the gun was here and the fingerprints were there, and then you start seeing videographic evidence, and then it piles up, and you think, you know what, I'm pretty certain that this thing took place. I mean, there's always room for the skeptic to come and say, well, I don't actually agree with you here, right? Do you see what I'm saying here, Carlos? Do you understand so far what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So a skeptic could always squeeze his way in and say, well, hold on, you know, this and hold on that and whatever, right? But what I'm saying to you is that the Muslim argument is one where we don't trivialize your rationality. We're not going to tell you that there's 3 in 1 or 1 in 3. We're not going to tell you that God is everywhere and therefore is in me and limited being, and therefore is, you know, he shares the acts of dependence and so on, pantheism you mentioned. All of these other isms that you've mentioned that are related to God's or the theistic project, if you like, are problematic, and we can argue that, right? And once again, that will be in the realm of logic, and you said that. But I would like to ask you a question, Carlos, just to show you that there are some, just to kind of add to the point that Hamza was mentioned. You said that you believe in logical arguments. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So, for example, the law of non-contradiction. Everyone knows what that is. You know, the law of non-contradiction, modus ponens. You know, modus tollens. All of these things are logical principles, right? You know, you agree with them. You believe in them. Pardon?
I think we've just lost Carlos there. Can admin bring Carlos back? Or is it with a disconnection?
Unfortunately, he's disconnected, and a few people are disconnected, possibly Hamza as well. So
Hamza's disconnected too as well. Okay.
All right. Well, I was just, hopefully he's still listening. I was going to say that really logic cannot be substantiated materially or empirically, right? Yet we still believe it, and we use it to form the scientific method. We use it generally to make arguments. But the atheist has to just say that it's axiomatic or that it's self-evident or something like this, right? But there's no actual evidence for the existence of it. And on materialism, there's no way of explaining its existence in the first place. So we're saying that by having a necessary existence or believing in something which everything depends upon and it depends upon nothing, or the ultimate explanation for the world, it ultimately explains things which otherwise would not be able to be explained. Things like logic, for example. Logic the scientific method, rationality, cognitive faculties, the mind, and so on and so forth. All of these things, which are hard problems, if you want to call them that, in philosophy, they would have solutions if you believed in a God. If you don't believe in a God, you'd actually have more things to have jumps. And this goes back to the title, right? You'd have more things. You'd have to have a leap of faith in believing. So by believing God, you have less leaps of faith to make. Because when you believe in a necessary existence through which everything else exists, so in other words, it's the master key category of all other existence is God, or is this necessary existence. In other words, everything depends upon this existence in order to exist, and this existence depends upon nothing in order to exist. When you have this, then you can say, well, we have rationality depends upon the necessary existence. Logic, the rules of logic, cognitive faculties, etc., depend upon so we can explain them through the necessary existence, because once again, the existence of everything cannot be come into preponderance from nothing, right? So it has to come ultimately from something that has no need for anything else, but itself, everything needs it. So we're saying that all of those things will become explained, if you like, rationality, logic, and so on. And because of that, we can say that you'd have less leaps of faith to make. So a lot of atheists are worried to become theists, if you like, or Muslims or whatever, because they're afraid that if they do so, they're making a leap of faith and they don't want to, But the truth of the matter is actually what they're doing is they're doing the opposite of that. Mm-hmm. When they are believing in a necessary existence, this anchors them and allows them to make sense of so many categories, right? So many categories which are impossible to make sense of otherwise, or you'd have to just say they exist because they exist, which is tautological, right? Which is just repeating the same words. It's a circular. You can't explain their existence except through their existence, which is what you call a circular argument. It's impossible, right? So if I say to you as an atheist or materialist, how do you account for logic, or how do you account for mathematics, or how do you account for the mind, or how do you account for consciousness, or how do you account for time being in the past, or how do you account for the scientific method, or how do you account for what explains all of those things? What explains it? And if you say, well, it explains itself, that's a circular argument. So if you say logic explains logic, it's circular. If you say the existence of rational faculties explains the existence of rational faculties, that's once again circular. So what you have to do is you have to find something outside the thing in order to explain the thing. And that's how you get out of the circularity. And what we're saying is that the only way you can do that, and in order to avoid ad nauseum and ad infinitum, this infinite regress, is to have a necessary being. A necessary being, which everything else, all of those other categories, depends upon in order for it to exist. So you're effectively, when you believe in a necessary being, what you're doing is you're starting off, by, okay, now you have an explanation for all of the other things you have no explanation for. You see what I mean? Because that's what Hamza also was saying. He's saying the skepticism is not justified. Because you have skepticism when it comes to the existence of a necessary existence, or a God, right? Or a higher power. But you don't have the same level of skepticism when it comes to things which actually don't have any evidence at all, which can't even be argued from first principles. Things like logic and the mind, and the time being in the past, mathematics, so many categories of things which you have to believe in order to have this discussion, right? And if you don't believe in them, but what is the explanation for all these things? So you have no explanation, and that is the problem. Is that I started off this show by saying, and I know because we only got 5 minutes left, so maybe we could do like my own final words. I started off this show by saying that atheism can't claim to be rational, and I think a lot of the guests came and agreed. It can't claim to be rational because rational means reasonable, and reasonable means logical, and it has to have an explanation or explanatory or irrefutational power. We have seen that atheism does not have that, cannot claim to be rational in that sense, that it has any justificational or refutational or explanational kind of power. It doesn't have any of that at all. So it can't claim to be rational from that angle. But not only is that the case, but we're seeing something even more powerful. We're seeing the fact that atheism leads to absurdity. That's another claim. That's a claim I'm making. Why? Because when you have a belief system which negates the existence of a necessary existence, through which everything else depends, you cannot explain the reason why your rational faculties exist, logic exists, mathematics exists, the mind exists, the self exists, the time is in the past. All of those categories there, which you desperately need, in order to have any conversation or to make any kind of claim, cannot be even had, or you cannot find any justification for them at all through your materialist worldview or atheist worldview. Therefore, in a nutshell, atheism is not, it can't claim to be rational, point one, and believing in atheism, and especially atheist materialism, leads to all kinds of absurdities, especially in regards to these categories of things which are required to have any kind of discourse in the first place.
Okay, Jazak Allah Khair. I just want to say apologies to Carlos. You got disconnected there, but God willing, do join our show next time, because we have to end our show very soon. Please join us again, and it was a pleasure having you. This is the discussion that we appreciate in SCDawah channel, as you can realize, the opportunity to speak and express yourself, and we learn from each other.
Yes, I'm back. I'm sorry, I got cut off just as you started asking your question. I apologize.
Yeah, as we were saying, because we have to end our show soon. Inshallah, God willing, you can join us again next time when we're discussing atheism on topics like this. So,
absolutely.
It was a pleasure having you here. Sorry you had this little disconnection problem. We had some technical difficulties as well. Like Hamza Zorsis has disconnected, but he said, that he will join us, inshallah, another session again with us. So, Brother Imran, final thoughts on this, because there's a lot of things that we discussed, and a lot of things we have agreed between ourselves, between atheists and agnostics on this, because the whole concept we were discussing is to explore the idea of the leap of faith and where it lies. Is it just religion or religious belief system where there's leap of faith, just by blind faith, and atheism is free from that? In fact, what we've understood from Hijab and others, and yourself as well, there's a lot of leaps of faith within atheistic concepts, as well as the whole idea of atheism doesn't seem to suit very rationally here. It's quite irrational concept. So would you mind just exploring the Islamic concept and why we consider Islamic concept to be rational, if you were to wrap this up finally, inshallah, with your thoughts?
Sure. I'm just going to touch on the deistic question that you had for Brother Carlos. So there's two other things to consider. Is imagine you have a maximally perfect being, which you say that God is. We put this argument forward. If that being were to create something that is purposeless and then left abandoned, this would necessarily be less maximally perfect than a being that would create something with purpose and then serves that purpose. So if from that perspective, it doesn't make the idea of having a God who creates something that's deficient in some way, it's purposeless and then abandoned. It takes away from this concept of God being a maximally perfect thing to start with. But the other aspect is actually something that Brother Hijab touched on, actually, was his human experience. We have in the history of humanity people who have appeared in different times, separated by different languages, by cultures, and geographically, who've come forward with this idea that God has contacted them and is passing on information. Now, this is almost ubiquitous within human culture and human experience and understanding. So we have to account for this. And there is the reason that we have to account for this is a phenomena that is not bound to a specific group of people, but is an experience of mankind. And actually, the only reasonable way to account for this is that there must be a source or an origin of this. Now, whether that's coming from something we would call the fitra, or whether that's coming because actually there's something God is actually making contact. Now, that's something that you have to come through looking at the evidences presented from the people who make these claims, and then analyze them, and then decide what you're going to accept and what you're going to not accept. But this is the idea that this ubiquitous sort of phenomenon that was occurring from mankind for eons is basically self-generated, is a little bit absurd, I think. So those are my two thoughts on this. Now, in terms of Islamically, I mean, two things that I would say. For me, and I agree with Hamza right as he was speaking to, I think it was the first brother who asked the question, who was the agnostic, who wasn't, who was very close to accepting the existence of God, I think. And that is that I've never been in that position where I've doubted that God existed, even in my darkest times. And it's because maybe there are a few things that I see. So I see value in people. When I look at for example, my children's eyes, I see them as valuable intrinsically as human beings. When I think, I experience the fact that I think freely. That even the fact that I can think and I can change my thoughts even as I'm speaking speaks to a fact that there is something that's not purely mechanistic and running along the lines of a Brownian motion, particles colliding with each other, resulting in consequences. Because then I would really just be a robot that's having no ability to think at all. My freedom would be an illusion, and I believe that I think freely. So there's many things that bring you to this. On top of this, even when we do the analysis, as Brother Hijab was mentioning earlier on, of the cosmological argument, the first cause, this coincides almost entirely with the best explanation and the theological position that best coincides with this is actually the Islamic concept, because we have this necessary being who is singular and who is the cause of everything, and we don't have confusing concepts such as Trinity, etc., that really require a lot of other not only gymnastics verbally but gymnastics mentally to try and to rationalize with. And it also is an explanatory framework where we can explain our consciousness, our freedom, and we can explain the existence of things like evil and suffering and its purpose within the world. Otherwise, we're not able to do these things. So I think there's lots of things from that Islamic perspective that come forward to support us in our perspective. And the other thing, which is probably the most important thing, is actually the text that we refer to, the Quran. If you simply contemplate upon this, it becomes very clear. And even, in Arabic, obviously, is very powerful. But even in any language, if you were contemplating what's being said to you, as written in the Quran to you, as applying to yourself, I think that many people would be moved by this completely and would understand that this is not the words of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because you can look at those words and you can see the difference between them. So I think that's in a summary sort of overall. But mashallah, Jazak Allah Khair to the brothers for everything, Brother Hijab and Brother mashallah, Hamza Zult says for everything. It's very, very useful, and I think I learned a lot, mashallah, about being with you guys, inshallah.
Jazak Allah Khair, all the brothers who have joined, and I want to especially thank Muhammad Hijab taking the time, as well as Hamza Zorsis and yourself, Imran, to be with us in SCDawah and share your understanding and your the reality of things, because not many people are exposed to these the discussion that we are having here in this platform. Books are often difficult to read, just with a lecture to attend sometimes may not be that interactive. Here we're providing this a platform where we can interact with each other and learn and engage, and then see where the discussion flows. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to come to a grasp of the reality where our purpose of existence is not that it's mere chance, that we just came and that's the end of it. Because everyone deep in their hearts know that you have a real purpose in this life. You're not just an atom floating around and that's going to be the end of it, like every other material things. But you see yourself, you yourself, someone, and you can see that there is a meaning to your life. What you need to do, as we are discussing here, that you need to channel these questions, channel these queries that you have, and really think about this intellectually rather than on an emotional stance. And when you really rationalize this, you will see that the only concept that makes sense is that there is a God, there is a creator, there is a being who is maximally perfect, uncaused cause, fully independent and self-sufficient. And that concept is only given to you in its purest form through Islam and Islamic scripture. And that's what we want to invite everyone to read and ponder and reflect. And until then, just say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.